afternoon. Just to let you know, we'll get started in about 5 minutes or so. We've heard there are people still coming back from lunch, so we want to get a few more participants in the room. So another 5 minutes of chatting and networking, and then we'll get underway. End of a long week, and so we want to make sure we keep on time and let you get on with the rest of your afternoons and evenings. So we're here today for a side event towards Rio 2027, Mobilising the Ocean Decade for BBNJ Delivery. My name's Alison Clausen. I'm from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, and I'm the Deputy Coordinator of the Ocean Decade. So it's a pleasure to be here. So welcome to those in the room and those online as well. It's been an incredible week, and a huge thanks to INPO and Mara for making space for this discussion today. So as we reach the end of the symposium program, this session is going to do two things. It's going to reflect on what we've heard over the last few days about the role of science and knowledge in BBNJ, but it's also going to look ahead. We want to explore how we can all work together to support delivery of BBNJ through the framework of the Ocean Decade. And to get us started, I'm going to welcome our first speaker, Leandro Pedron, who is the Director of the Thematic Programs Department at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, who's going to make some welcoming remarks. So welcome, Leandro.
Good afternoon. Hope you are doing well. And as Alison mentioned, we are starting to finalize all of this amazing week regarding the BBNJ Symposium. And when we talk about ocean, and we need to get steps back and understand how the ocean has become and ascending its importance in the negotiations and the policymakers and everything else, and the Ocean Decade of Science for Sustainable, that's the Ocean Decade, that's all of us have been working together, was a time that when we looked at the ocean, we always connect to science. And now when you look to the BBNJ, that's the first international agreement that puts biodiversity in international waters. With this respect, look in science. I think that we also need to understand how connect them the Ocean Decade and BBNJ, and to think forward, to think when the decade will well, it's a decade, so 2021 to 2030, but what's the process beyond? And now we have BBNJ, so using the science as the main cooperation between the two of them and continuing the job and counting so everyone in the room has been discussing and working and put science at first to bring back to the policies and then build and have sustainable use of the ocean and continue of the humankind. So that's the idea. Thank you again, Alison, for inviting me to join you in this panel. Thank you also again for INPO and Mara, and hope that's a wonderful panel to listen and learn about. Thank you.
Thank you, Leandro. And as you're here, Leandro and his team at the Ministry are essential partners in what we're going to be talking a lot about today, which is the 2027 Ocean Decade Conference, which of course is going to be held here in Rio, hence the title of this event. You're going to hear more about the conference in just a minute, but it is really a critical moment for the Ocean Decade and for the BBNJ community as well. The decade is now at the midpoint of its implementation. There's been a lot of activity. We have over 60 global programs, nearly 600 projects, but the focus of the decade as it moves into its second half is really now on ensuring that science and knowledge can inform policy, can inform decision-making from the global to the local level. And that's going to be a very strong focus of the conference that will be held here in Rio next April. That conference is going to be a key moment for the scientific community and stakeholders to build new partnerships and initiatives. And you'll hear how over the coming year, the Decade Coordination Unit, which is hosted within IOC UNESCO, together with the wider Decade community, and we hope many of you, is going to really facilitate dialogue to identify priority actions, both for the remainder of the decade to 2030, but then also the longer term legacy. And so of course the BBNJ agreement sits squarely within this conversation. As we've heard throughout this symposium, and as Leandro just said, science and knowledge are really at the heart of the agreement. And we really need to build on what is already happening in the decade around BBNJ, use that as a starting point to really bring a new community together as we look towards Rio in 2027 and beyond. So that's what we're going to hear about from the speakers today. So to get us to the next phase of this discussion, I invite Julienne Barbier, the Head of Marine Policy and Regional Coordination at IOC, and also the Coordinator of the Decade, to give some welcoming words, but also to give you a presentation on what to expect from the conference here in 2027. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Alison and Leandro. Safe return to Brasilia, and thank you for all your support this week. Good to see you all. Thank you for sticking with us until the end for this event today. And indeed, given the topic of this symposium on knowledge and science for BBNJ and the venue, it was very difficult for us not to be here. And this is really why we propose to the organizers. And again, I want to thank Smara Consultants and INPO for this, giving us that space, but really to have a bit of a discussion about what the decade is doing in terms of generating science and knowledge for BBNJ approach. When we started the decade, the BBNJ agreement was not yet agreed. It only came, agreed in 2023, even though the issue had been discussed for over 20 years at the UN General Assembly. But I think, and this is the beauty of having an ocean decade. An ocean decade is relatively long and allows you to really adapt and focus on priorities that are emerging. And I think this is really what we need to do, is really ensure that the knowledge delivery, which sometimes is going even faster than the political deliberations, is supporting the decision-making process of the agreement. And I think we have now huge opportunities with knowledge gaps that are becoming clearly spelled out, specific processes that needs to be put in place, data aspects and data flows that needs to be put in place. All of this, I think, provides a challenge to the scientific community to be able to address those and work in a collaborative way, because this is, of course, the only way to do this at the scale of the BBNJs. So what we want to do today is give you a little bit of an overview of what has been done in the framework of a decade, and then these huge opportunities that we have with the conference next year to really align efforts, to mobilize more investments in science, in observation, in capacity development, around this BBNJ focus. And I think the conference that we will have here in Rio will certainly give space for that, and will be an opportunity for us to work collectively on some of those focus where we need to address in the coming years. So that's the panel. I think you've presented that, or no, maybe not, but just to give you an overview of who's going to be with us talking about some of those activities that we are doing in the framework of a decade. But I'll let Alison present them, and we'll have also Margaret Leinen, who will be giving a keynote on the science of the BBNJ and what also has been done in the decade. And moving to this one, this guy. So just wanted to show you this slide because it provides a bit of a snapshot in terms of what are the different activities going on in the decade that are contributing to BBNJ. And as Alison said, this is not actually a fair picture because we have over 20% of our decade programs that are actually addressing directly BBNJ issues, and over probably 100 projects, endorsed decade projects that are also focusing on those areas. But there are, I think, very important mechanisms focusing on the characterization of a deep sea, the mapping aspects. We have a very important seabed initiative, a seabed 2030 initiative ongoing. We have development observing systems with new technologies coming on, genomics, but also how we can expand the existing framework around ocean observation to deeper parts of the ocean to be able to measure and track changes in those environments. We have programs that are looking at the synthesis of science for policymaking and also communicating this information to decision makers, to political bodies. We have programs working on capacity development, on ocean literacy, on inclusivity aspects, also bringing indigenous and local knowledge systems into the picture. So just to give you again a snapshot of a vast amount of work that is being done in these programs. So the second part of my job is to give you a bit of more details and information on the Ocean Decade Conference, which, as I said, is a huge opportunity to align and coordinate our efforts in science for BBNJ. We have 391 days before the conference, so this will be from 7 to 9 April 2027. Those of you who are here in the room, you all know your way now to Rio, so it shouldn't be a challenge. This is going to be actually more than just a 3-day conference, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I just want to also explain that those global conferences are a very important moment in the lifespan of a decade. They really allow the communities to come together, to look at what's been achieved, and to set priorities for the future. So we started the decade in 2021. It was the COVID. We didn't really have a chance to bring the community together, but we still managed to have a number of kickoff virtual events and with the support of Germany. In 2024, we had the Decade Conference in Barcelona, and maybe some of you were there. And then, you know, as it's been foreseen in the implementation plan of the decade, every 3 years until the end, we have this conference. So 2027 will be the next one. And then we will close the Ocean Decade in 2030 with another one, and venues to be decided at a later stage. So this is what we achieved in 2024, and this is very much our baseline. We want to do not less than what we did in Barcelona, and hopefully even more, both in terms of bringing the community together, and you know, we had over 124 countries participating in this conference, with a lot of focus also to bring early career ocean professionals, representatives and experts from small island developing states, from least developing countries. And to do that, we also had to provide travel support and again work with various sponsors to help us bring those important stakeholders to the table. We also developed a number of important papers developed through community workshops and expert groups, and this was the Vision 2030 process, which was basically looking at the strategic ambition of each of the 10 decade challenges that were defined, and those 10 decade challenges are addressing both you know, environmental and ecological aspects, marine pollution, climate change impacts, but also the human kind of dimension of ocean sustainability with economic aspects, with inclusivity aspect, capacity development, ocean literacy, as well as, of course, the scientific infrastructure. So we came up with a Barcelona statement, which basically gave a focus in terms of priority setting for the decade for the following years. And those addressed a number of important aspects, both in terms of knowledge priorities, but also in terms of cross-cutting and enabling environment priorities that we need to build around the decade to ensure that the science there's more investment in science, but also there's more use of that science for action. And those touch upon financing aspects, innovation, technologies, and capacity development, just to name a few. So we want the Rio conference really to be a space, as I said, to showcase the achievements that have been done by the entire community and the thousands of stakeholders working around the world. We also want a space for Brazil to shine at this conference. Brazil has been leading, you know, engagement in the Ocean Decade from day one, I would say. And as we have seen during this week, and as we have seen over, you know, all our relationship with, you know, the science community, the philanthropic community, there's a lot of work being done here that we would want also to showcase. To really demonstrate how you know, actions and best practices can advance our goals. We also want this decade to focus on the urgent and immediate actions towards the end of a decade. So this, as we are starting to look towards the end of a decade, very important to accelerate policy impact of all the work that's being done. And with these hundreds of projects and programs, we need to consolidate. We need to create this collaboration across you know, common issues. and certainly this will be one of our goals. We also want to secure and identify where we need commitments and engagement, partnerships, to lay the foundation for the legacy of a decade beyond. What are we going to leave behind? What kind of infrastructures, what kind of new modalities of delivering science and knowledge needs to be sustained over time? And then the last point, which I think is an important one, is, and also again a huge opportunity, we will have a 2028 UN Ocean Conference, which will be held in Korea, and this is hosted by Korea and Chile. And we have potentially an opportunity to really contribute the outcomes of a Rio conference and to shape the agenda of that UN Ocean Conference in 2028. And this is why we have some discussions now ongoing with the organizers of that conference. So just to look at the week of April 2027, as I said at the beginning, it's not just a 3-day conference. We're looking at this as a whole week of events with a number of partner-led satellite events, which are going to be organized in various venues. Those of you who were maybe in Barcelona, remember we had over 120 satellite events across all towns. So whilst we want diversity, we also want to maybe focus a bit more these events around thematic days where several events addressing similar issues would be meeting together and being in the same place. So we will propose also a grouping for these events and certainly open that up for our partners and Decade Actions to come forward with proposals. And then we have the Decade Conference itself, 3 days, which will be taking place in just across the water there in the warehouse. You can see coming out of the museum here. This will be our venue for this. And during that time, as we have done in Barcelona, we also want really Rio to become the ocean capital of the world. And to do that, we really need to really generate and motivate stakeholders locally, but also internationally to bring the wonder of the ocean in Rio. So we will start by potentially having a number of research vessels that will be berthed just across the water. And we have already started to discuss with some of them, and certainly we would like to see even more. So this will be important for showcasing, research and how cooperation can be also built in those areas. But we also want, civil society events. We want exhibits and campaigns across the whole town. Just a quick overview of who's doing what in the organization of a Rio conference. So as Alison mentioned, the Decade Coordination Unit at IOC is kind of overlooking the overall implementation and delivery of a decade. We are working with our national partner, which is the Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation, but also with our local partner, the Municipal Council of Rio de Janeiro, who have been also very much engaged in the process and also supporting our work. We also have an international program committee which has been established and already met once. Their role is really to advise on the structure of a program, the content, the format, potentially help with identification of speakers, session leaders, but also help us with the whole communication aspects of a conference, and also some of the kind of process of selection for side events, for example, that we will need to put in place. We have a National Executive Committee, and we just met this morning with many of the national and local agencies that are going to be playing a role, and this includes from the Foreign Affairs to the Navy to the City Council to all sort of institutions that will have a role to play. And then we have a National Decade Committee, which is the Brazil National Decade Committee, which we also look forward to propose a number of activities during the conference that we can integrate in the overall program. A couple of milestones from now until Rio. We will be opening in May and June a call of expression for a first round of satellite events. And this will be around those thematic days that I mentioned, and I'll come back to that in a second. And what we're looking for is basically partner organizations can play and coordinate, because we will not have the capacity to coordinate all of this at the level of the decade coordination unit. So that's why we need your support, but coordinate the organization of those thematic days with other partners. In August and in September, we'll be then opening up for the actually event that will populate those thematic days. So that will come a little bit later. And then we intend to open the registration for the conference in October, with a process also for participants from the LDCs and smaller and developing states and ECOPs to request travel support to attend the conference. And that also links to sponsorship and so on, but we certainly, our goal is to at least equal the number of participants that we managed to bring to Barcelona, if not more. And then as we move towards the end of the year, we will then finalize the program with the session leads and the speakers, and intend to have the program publicly available around November. Just to give you a bit of an idea of how we are intending to frame the conference, and particularly the 3 days. Whilst, as I said at the beginning, the decade has been organized around 10 decade challenges, we feel it's now important to focus on solutions, and solutions for civil society, for decision makers, for industry. And this is really changing a little bit the paradigm, where, as in Barcelona, we started from the science and looking at what we need to achieve in terms of scientific priorities. Here, we're going to start from the need of policy actions, ocean management, and really focus and maybe narrow down a number of solution areas where we would want all the decade ecosystem to contribute to through the challenges and through the different programs and projects. So the key question here is really, what are the priority areas where ocean knowledge can accelerate impact through policy and decision making? And that will be a kind of a framing question to enter into these discussions around the solution delivery. And as we are going towards the conference, our ambition is to have a number of ocean decade solutions blueprints prepared, which would be actually paper that will identify needs and priorities, but also potentially commitments of decade partners for joint actions, and identified resources and partnership needs, and also with a call to action, which we can then echo in other international events coming up the following year. So those solution blueprints will be developed in a participatory way through workshops. And we are starting as soon as we are back from Brazil to actually line up the process, and then also reach out to decade partners, to decade collaborative centers and decade implementing partners to help us to lead the organization of those workshops. And we will basically implement these throughout 2026. There will be also discussions at the regional level, because those blueprints will need to be also tailored to the need of the tropical Atlantic region, to the South Atlantic, to the Indian Ocean, to North Pacific. And we have regional partners in each of those regions that will be able to help us to organize that discussion as well, but also with the idea that they will be also having more granularity in terms of the priorities for specific regions. So just to wrap up, just to give you an idea of what those solution areas look like. And we have identified 5 thematic solution areas. And again, those have been defined through a pretty exhaustive analysis of policy documents, of treaties, of agreements, of regional conventions, which have been reviewed, and where we really try to pick some of those requirements that where science, where knowledge, where innovation is identified to increase impact. And after a number of discussion, also at the recently held Ocean Science meeting in Glasgow with the decade programs, we've came up with those 5 areas, and you can see in the backdrop there some of the kind of policy kind of requirements or demand behind those, whether they are the UNFCCC or whether they are the BBNJ or CBD. And in the middle there, you can see the cross-cutting aspects, because we believe that to deliver on all those 5 thematic solution areas, we are going to need a focus on observation, data, and services, a focus on financing, and particularly access to financing and sustained investment, as well as on capacity development, ocean literacy for all. So that's basically what those thematic days are going to look like pre-conference. And that structure will be also reflected in the main conference, the 3-day conference, through a number of plenary and parallel sessions where we will be able to, again, look at those blueprints papers and enrich them, improve them, and really ensure that they respond to the community, and then we frame that into the Rio statement at the end. So that's the work ahead. Still a huge amount of coordination and engagement with all our partners and those who are not yet our partners, because the decade is an open process, and we want certainly to also provide room for new things, new activities, new innovation that we haven't really thought about so far. So today is really a bit of a start of that process, and also a call for all of you, all stakeholders, to engage in that process and help us to deliver a really strong outcome for the Rio conference next year. And I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, hopefully that has inspired you to start looking at flights and accommodation for next April to come back to this wonderful city. We hope to be having some of the thematic days that Julian mentioned in this venue as well. So we hope to see many of you back here again in 391 days' time to continue the discussions about the Ocean Decade, and of course BBNJ being a central part of that. Just before we come to Margaret's keynote, I just did want to remind you that Slido is available. So that will be available for during the, well, you can use it at any time, but if there are questions that come up either about Julian's presentation, Margaret's keynote, or the panelist, please use this, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end where we can, thank you, where we can get to those questions. But moving right along, we have the absolute honour of having Margaret Leinen now speak to us about the science and knowledge priorities in the BBNJ agreement, but with a particular focus on the work being done in the Ocean Decade and the way that we can use this unique framework of the decade to really support BBNJ delivery. So Margaret has been intimately involved in the very DNA of the conception of the decade. She served in many of the early planning groups. She was a co-chair of the Decade Advisory Board. So I dare say she knows the decade as well as anybody else, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to have her speak to us this afternoon. So maybe if we can jump back to the main presentation, and I would like to invite Margaret onto the stage to give her address. You have a table that you can use if you want to sit down.
Oh, great. Yes, that would help. So Julian introduced you to a lot of the scope of the decade with respect to BBNJ, and I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into each one of those programs to tell you how they're going to help the decade. So as he said, there are many aspects of all of the programs of the decade that are going to help in the sense of, for example, ocean literacy and so forth. But a few of the programs really have things at their very heart that are going to be really important. And first I would mention Ocean Census and Marine Life 2030. And is Alex Rogers still here? Oh, okay. Because before he went to NOC, he was the chief scientist of Ocean Census and could tell you about it in much greater detail. But both Ocean Census and Marine Life 2030 have at their heart the exploration of the deep ocean organisms and the description of those organisms. So earlier today, Murray said, you know, how are we going to get all of the descriptions of these organisms so that we can get eDNA and use it effectively? And these two programs really bring a lot of resources to that question. Ocean Census, with substantial funding from the Nippon Foundation, has already started having cruises in significant areas, the Coral Triangle and other areas, to really collect material, sequence that material, and they have also engaged marine taxonomists. So I think that they've written to every marine taxonomist in the world to try to engage them with Ocean Census and to provide resources to them, financial resources, so that they can describe species. Marine Life 2030 has a more ecosystem approach, but it's definitely engaged in the collection of organisms and the identification of new species and the sequencing of those. So those two programs really are going to contribute the opportunity to identify more things and to sequence them so we can use them. Second, I was really glad you mentioned Seabed 2030, because I think a lot of times people don't think about it in terms of the contribution to biology. But of course, a lot of what we are looking at in our programs, and certainly that BBNJ is looking at, is the benthos and the organisms that inhabit the seafloor. So Seabed 2030 is the mapping exercise for the ocean decade. And I think I heard that when we started, there was 5% of the ocean mapped, and we're now about 20, I thought I remembered that number, 27% in about 6 years. That's astonishing. And it really shows you how galvanizing the entire community to focus their efforts in a short period of time, and engaging the private sector, which has given all of the transit data between the jobs that they're doing to the decade, is really changing things. So when you think about all of the trenches, the seamounts, everything, being able to really have effective maps of those areas for our look with BBNJ is essential. Then I also want to mention the Deep Ocean Observation Strategy Group, DOOS, and DOSI, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, both of which I think have really galvanized the deep sea community to, I don't see Lisa Levin, but she calls it the deep decade. And they have come together in a way that is really remarkable. Then you heard a little bit about OBON, the Ocean Biomolecular Observing Network, earlier this morning. A couple of other programs, ditto, the Digital Twins of the Ocean, has really embraced getting biology into these digital twins in a way that hasn't been present before, and has started working with us for getting eDNA into digital twins and conceptualizing how that would work. And then finally, I talked a bit about OBIS and the challenges of OBIS. OBIS is working very closely with IODE, the IOC's data program to develop more tools for interoperability and platforms that we can use that are going to make it easier to get data into OBIS. But other than that, I want to talk about some other aspects of the decade that I think are really setting the stage for us to work more effectively in BBNJ. So those of you who have been involved with the programs or the projects know that there are some requirements of programs and projects. The first one is that they will all be co-designed. And we heard a thread running through the last 3 days about the importance of working with the communities that are affected or the communities that are around these areas to engage them in the design of the work. And this has really, I think, changed a lot of the thinking around large programs in ocean science. So I hear more and more programs that aren't involved with the decade paying attention to the importance of co-design. It's really a cultural shift in the way that we think about doing oceanography and doing programs like this that has really been spurred by the ocean decade. A second one is capacity development. So none of the programs, none of the projects can be endorsed without a substantial capacity development component. That also has changed the culture around large efforts like this. And I see both of those programs that I talked about, which are not yet part of the decade, Neptune Mission and InSync Antarctica, both have very, very strong capacity development components. And so I think that this is now an expectation of large programs in ocean science that wasn't an expectation before. And that's a legacy of the decade as much as any of the programs or projects are. Third, the requirement for international collaboration and multiple countries, multiple fields being represented in Ocean Decade programs. And that also has been, it's really opened the door for a lot of connections that we didn't have before. And we have seen this play out in the way that the programs are discussed, and we see it play out in the conduct of those programs. And last and definitely not least, ECOPS. And this is also a requirement for the programs and the projects to really involve the early career ocean professionals. And that sets the stage for the future in a way that we weren't actively thinking about before the Ocean Decade. And I think that also is going to be a really important legacy of the decade for BBNJ. So although none of those four things that I mentioned are exclusively pointed at BBNJ, all of them are going to be real contributions to our ability to engage in BBNJ. So I'll stop there, and I know that we have a great panel coming up, and I've gotten to see all of the questions, so I know that it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, Margaret. And I think a really interesting perspective, not only on the programs and the research that is being done, but the other enabling conditions that need to be put in place to ensure that science and knowledge is generated in a way that is relevant, that is timely, and that can be used to inform policy. And that is exactly what we're going to get into with our panel right now. So let me Yes, thank you to the technical team. Another reminder about Slido, so please do have your questions coming while the panel is speaking, and we'll get to those at the end of the panel. But if we can jump back to the main slide deck, thank you, where we have our wonderful panelists in photo, and you're going to get to see them in the flesh as well. So I'd really like to kindly invite Jesse, Janina, and Ronaldo to join me on the stage. And as they're coming up, I'll just give you a quick introduction. So we have Jesse Cleary, a geographer from the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University. You can try and sit under your photos if you'd like. I'm not sure if that's going to work, but let's see. Janina Bumbe, who's a project manager for the Biodiversity Conservation at the Boticario Foundation and a member of the program committee for the Rio conference. So very, very happy to have Janina with her link to Rio. And then Ronaldo Cristofoletti, who's just joined us after 2 months in Antarctica, and who is a professor at the Federal University of Sao Paulo and a very dear member of our Decade Advisory Board and of the Brazilian National Decade Committee. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we will have about 35 minutes to go through a series of questions with the panelists. And we're actually going to start with you, Margaret, following on from your keynote. And I wanted to, you mentioned the programs that are underway, some of the different initiatives, the sort of these enabling factors. And I was wondering if you think that looking at that, there are specific questions or issues that the decade is really in a unique position to help to support BBNJ delivery, that those characteristics of the decade that you talked about are really the things that are really going to be uniquely positioned to support BBNJ. So there's a microphone there.
Yes, I think that, that I covered quite a bit of this, but I would say that the other thing is that if we can establish a dialogue between the decade and BBNJ so that the decade programs are more aware of the specific challenges that BBNJ is facing, whether those are samples or whether those are specific sites that are being considered, that conversation will drive the science. Because I think in that way, BBNJ is going to be an attractor for the scientific community. And so as BBNJ starts talking about this, a communication between us will allow the decade to be a more effective partner for BBNJ.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely, and I think that is one area in the decade. In the first 5 years, there was a lot of activity, and we were almost at the point where it was just generating the momentum and the energy, but in this next 5 years, we have to be super focused on where those most important gaps and priorities are, and having some of those more formal linkages and conversations with the BBNJ agreement and the Secretariat and member states when the operation is put into place will help us really focus the resources where they are most needed, and certainly the decade has that role to play in that prioritization. So great, Jesse. Hi. So Jesse, coming to you, and I want to focus your questions a little bit on ocean data. You obviously have a strong engagement in OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System that Margaret already mentioned. I'm sure a lot of people heard about it earlier in the symposium, but perhaps you could start just by giving a sort of a brief overview of OBIS. But it's also a formal part of the decade. It is endorsed as a part of the Ocean Decade. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how OBIS can work, both within and outside the decade framework, to really support BBNJ delivery.
Yeah, great, thank you, and thanks for having me on the panel. So I will first say that I'm going to give you, I think, an external but adjacent perspective. I haven't really participated very closely in the Ocean Decade so far, but I think my perspective on that is as a working in the data provision elements to OBIS. So our lab at Duke runs OBIS CMAP, which is the OBIS node storing information about marine mammals, seabirds, sea turtles, and sharks and rays. So those species occurrence records are then centralized within the OBIS database and then turned into other data products. So that perspective, I think, is, it gives me a little bit of the beginning part of the Ocean Decade work. And then also we're working with maybe at the kind of receiving information out of the Ocean Decade and out of OBIS as we're thinking about supporting ABMT proposals. And so we've done work with the Sargasso Sea, the Thermal Dome, and then some new projects with the Living High Seas project that will be receiving information from OBIS potentially. So if we think of OBIS as a sort of a federated digital ocean ecosystem, and so because of its global reach, it can provide, I think, a really important baseline for BBNJ. So we really think of it as being probably part of the data backbone for BBNJ. And I think Julian had the institutional bridge idea between IOC, UNESCO, and BBNJ. And I'd like, for data, of course, needs to be a really strong theme, a plank in that connection there. And so where our work is receiving information from OBIS is mostly about thinking about ABMT proposals. So we think that OBIS will be a really important part in providing species occurrence records into those proposals and the development of those proposals. We talked about derivative products, and Margaret talked about this as well. Species distribution models will be an important part of the information that will flow from OBIS into ABMT proposals. But I also want to make sure we talk about the interconnection between those proposals and OBIS. I think it will be really important for OBIS to be paying attention to the proposals as they develop, because we're developing a network. And for us to understand what's missing in the network, we need to have sort of a global perspective on data distribution and species occurrence records, so we can kind of understand what are in ABMT proposals and what we might be missing. And then one last element I would mention here in terms of OBIS and BBNJ, that as data managers, we really need to hear really specific guidance on what's needed. So from the BBNJ perspective, as ABMT proposals are being developed, I think data managers, data scientists need really specific requirements about the tools, algorithms, data development procedures that they need to have in place to better support those. So making sure that that gets back to data managers, I think will really help OBIS really inform BBNJ on that ABMT specifics. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that complements, in some ways, some of the themes that Margaret's bringing up about that really clear identification of the gaps and the priorities. And again, I do think that's where the decade can play a role, and particularly using this next 12 months in the lead up to Rio with the momentum from symposiums like this, from the PrepCom that's going to take place in a couple of weeks, to be bringing this community together to already looking at that state of play, that baseline, but also where those gaps and priorities, so that can be brought to a broader audience at the conference in Rio and really taken forward from there, both in a short and longer term perspective. So coming to you, Janina, and talking about short and longer term perspectives, there's been a lot of discussion here at the symposium, of course, and we'll continue about investment and the resourcing for BBNJ delivery. As I mentioned, you're on the program committee for Rio, but you're also a member of other very important structures within the decade, including the Foundations Dialogue, which is a network of around 30 now philanthropic foundations who work with the Ocean Decade to help think through how we can increase investment in ocean science and how we can really optimize the benefits of investment in ocean science. And you, of course, hosted us here in this room again 2 years ago for the in-person meeting of the Foundations Dialogue. So I know you have a great vision of what's happening in that community. And I'd be really interested to hear from you, both from Boticario, but also more broadly within the dialogue and within the philanthropic community. How are you seeing your role in supporting BBNJ delivery? And do you think philanthropy is ready to meet the challenges and the demands that are probably going to be put upon it in thinking about BBNJ delivery?
Thanks, Alison, Julian, for the invitation. I said 2 years ago, they always lead to Rio, and here we are again, and next year again. So I will rent a house here, maybe, looking for something. To speak in the name of the philanthropy is a bit tricky because we are a really diverse ecosystem. But working a long time within the sector and with our peers in the Foundation's dialogue as well. I see we have a common ground. Philanthropy has long passed not working just as funders anymore. So nowadays we have we possess a unique capacity of catalyst, risk, and innovation. And we can bridge it, we can fill the gaps where many times the government and other institutions can't work. So we can take that risk innovation and bring it to the ecosystem, bring it to the solutions as well. And after that, besides that, we also work closely in the articulation of different sectors, so we can dive more freely between the government, third sector, private sector, society, civil society. So that helps us to make this close, to talk these different languages into one common goal, together with the other institutions from the third sector that act on this as well. And so we talk about the foundations dialogue in the panel before, and it's not anymore about how much you need to fund, but how you fund. So another thing is that we can work with co-design, we can influence the way of the projects and the programs, and the decisions can be made in the way we can finance with these prerequisites.
Thank you. And I think what you say, it's not about necessarily always about how much we're funding, but how we're funding. And I know there's been a lot of discussion in the Foundation's dialogue, which I think will be very important for BBNJ, including around issues such as inclusivity, diversity, and equity, how funders are encouraging traditional knowledge and Indigenous-led research to contribute to efforts such as BBNJ. So it really has become this forum, I think, that has spawned ideas and thinking that is influencing outside its immediate circle.
Alison just didn't answer if you are ready for that. You asked that about the readiness. I'd say we have tools, the right tools. We have a path ahead, but we will only be ready when assuming we'll never be ready for that, because we have to be constantly evolving, being innovative, and including new ways and perspectives and approaches for doing the things. So that's our main strength. So we're not ready, but you keep on moving.
In the best possible way, of course. And yeah, again, that is, we've seen that in the decade, that gap that philanthropy fills in that adaptability and flexibility in response to emerging issues that other funders can't necessarily fill. So thank you. And we'll come back to this philanthropic question in just a moment. But before that, we're going to go to Ronaldo, who has, I think, been a hugely influential voice in the decade around ocean literacy, around capacity development, around bringing those two communities together and seeing where where the synergies are between ocean literacy and capacity development. And as I said, we're absolutely delighted that you're part of the recently renewed Decade Advisory Board. And we're going to start with somewhat of a philosophical question for you, Ronaldo. So we all know that geopolitically, from a humanitarian level, we're living in difficult times. We had a discussion at lunch today that not everybody even wants to open the newspaper anymore, right, Denise? To see what's going on. So, given this context that we're living in, do you think the world at large, and I know it's hard to generalise, but thinking about sort of the general public, the individuals on the street, do you think the world at large cares about BBNJ? And if not, how can we use ocean literacy, capacity development approaches, particularly through the Ocean Decade, to enhance that feeling of connection and that feeling that it's worth caring about BBNJ and what it's hoping to achieve?
Thanks, Alison. Thanks for the opportunity and invitation to be here. Yeah, I think the first part of my answer will not make it the most popular in this room, but it's everyone out there, people that is walking here now in the museum or out, is wondering about BBNJ. I'm pretty sure not. They don't really know what that means, and they have many other problems going on, social problems, economic problems, and unfortunately now all the geopolitical problems in the world growing. So why should they care about it? And I think that is the answer that we need to work out as this bubble as well, understanding we know why that is important, but how can we make that accessible for those people that don't think about it? And sometimes the answer will be obvious, like, oh, okay, but the ocean controls the climate, or the fisheries, there's impact to our life, but they're not even thinking about the ocean. So we learned a lot already in the ocean decade in how to map those different parts, because we always say we need to talk with the society. Society is a wide range of people with different backgrounds. So we need really to understand who we want to talk with. What's our target audience? And then from there, mapping the proper message for that kind of audience. And there are many people. How many of us really properly understood better BBNJ during these last 3 days, learned something being here? And we are the very small bubble that chose to be here. Imagine who is not here. So we need to have very clear narratives and messages for them so they understand why that is important in their life. And the Ocean Decade has been, during these first 5 years, designing and learning a lot in how to bring about the ocean. So with the BBNJ, you'll be now one step of it, one part of it, and we don't need to restart from the zero. We just can get in from the learnings and the platforms that were designed in the decade, but focusing on the BBNJ and trying to engage a society that has many other problems, but to understand that, yes, this one is also really important.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valuable point of view, and it's something we do want to do more of in the decade, also because we hear from our more science, the natural and physical scientists working with us, we're not necessarily communicators. That's not necessarily our job. So bringing in other specialists, experts with your skill sets, other social scientists, strategic communications experts that can work hand in hand with the scientific community. And that's certainly an ambition of the decade. We hope through a revamped decade coordination office for ocean literacy to be able to provide resources for these groups to come together to synthesize and get the message out. So hopefully that's something by the time we get to Rio next April that we'll be able to talk in more detail about how those resources are going to be made available to different decade programs and projects. So keep your questions coming on Slido. There are already a lot there, so I do want to get to them, but I do have one more question for a sort of a brief answer from each of our panelists. So Margaret, I'll come back to you. As I mentioned in my introduction, you have been involved in the decade from the very, very earliest days and know it inside out and have observed how it's evolved and changed. What do you think are some of the aspects of the decade that could be enhanced as we think about coming back to Rio in a year's time, as we think about moving towards the end of the decade, to ensure that it really is fully ready to act as a global action framework for BBNJ?
I think the most important thing that we need to do is have all of those programs that are so connected to BBNJ get together and have a workshop on how we can really activate the whole landscape for this important treaty. And it's not the decade is so big, you heard, 600 projects. They're not able to, bring us all together once a year or every 6 months to talk. But I think that I think we need to talk amongst the programs and go after some funding to have a workshop sooner rather than later. I think a year it's too late. And work with some of the people that we've now met here that are leaders in the BBNJ actions and start to get some of the, Jesse, the information that you need about what they're doing and try to understand better not just what they need, but when they need it.
Yes, relevant and timely, often the words we use in the decade. So it's what and when to make sure it gets where it needs to go by the time it needs to go. So I think that's a very concrete suggestion and a call to action for all of us. I think it fits in very, very well with the process that we've envisaged in the lead up to Rio with the development of these different solutions blueprints. And obviously, as Julian presented, there is a solution that is looking at marine biodiversity from the coast to the deep ocean. I see Matt Frost in the audience here, who is working with us very, very closely, and also the Belgian National Decade Committee, to actually have a workshop in the margins of the World Conference on Marine Biodiversity, which we held in Bruges in November this year. So if the BBNJ part of that discussion could come together in advance of the conference in Bruges and bring that to the broader solution area on marine biodiversity, I think that would be an excellent idea. So very, very happy to follow up with you on that and see how we can make that a reality. So Jessie, talking about stakeholder groups and networks and bringing people together, thinking from the point of view, and I really like your perspective, as you said, as sort of a parallel or an adjacent position or perspective coming at it from OBIS. What do you, hearing more about the decade now, what partnerships or what stakeholders or what new resources do you think OBIS could benefit from? Again, coming through the decade framework or elsewhere, to really get it to that point that Margaret's been describing about, being on the delivery of that timely and relevant data.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really key question, I think, and as to how it connects. So a couple thoughts on that. Again, as our work as a client or consumer of this information and bringing this into spatial planning processes and BB&J planning, the capacity building elements are really important for us. Like, we would like to be supporting these communities, not just developing the data for them, but showing them how these data can be useful in their work, and like kind of leaving that sort of capacity as it's connected with OBIS as part of our work in the regions that we're working on. So those capacity building elements are really important, whether those are coming from the Ocean Decade or other entities engaged in the enterprise. Of course, we need to be making connections towards the future to think about the STB and the clearinghouse mechanism, what those are going to look like, how data flows in and out of those, and making sure that we're kind of aware of those discussions, I think. A really important point, I think, about the kind of stakeholders that we need to be engaging, if we haven't already, is a variety of important area processes that are currently ongoing. So we were really fortunate to do data development and mapping support for the CBD EBSA process. And so OBIS was a key data set into that process. And there are a number of follow-on important area processes for marine mammals, for sharks and rays, and now we'll have one for sea turtles. And I think that OBIS could benefit from a better, tighter connection with those processes in terms of the data that are being described in those processes and making sure those data are part of OBIS. And I think the important part of that is that those important areas are often going to be the seed of ABMT proposals in some form. And so to make sure that we understand the data that went into an EBSA, an EMA, ISRA, and as that's carried forward into a potential ABMT proposal, we want to make sure that those data are in the OBIS network and so can be relied upon by other ABMT proposals in the sort of networking sense that I've mentioned. So I think that's going to be a really important kind of connection point there. Yeah, and then I think the other kind of stakeholders we would want to engage is the coalitions that are forming to make ABMT proposals. And we want to make sure that we're talking with those groups and that they have the information that they need, and also can feed back requirements that, as I mentioned before, the tools, the algorithms, the data development that they would like to support their work as they're developing their proposals.
Great, thank you. And I think, as we were thinking about the decade and the observations data piece of the decade, and certainly when we made the presentations on the sort of the preparation process for Rio at the Ocean Sciences meeting a couple of weeks ago, we sort of put up observations and data. It's going to be a priority issue. And there was a very, very clear message coming back in all the events. It's observations, data, and the services, applications, and tools that these communities actually need to be able to translate that into their work. So yeah, I think that's very much aligned with what you're saying about taking that building of the capacity to be able to, and the building of the tools to be able to use that data for decision making as well. So thank you. Janina, coming back to the philanthropic world, and you mentioned in the Foundation's dialogue, it's a very diverse group, hard for you to speak for one voice, and we know it's true. There are many different ways that philanthropy is supporting ocean science and probably will support BBNJ, and I just wondered if you could give us a bit of an overview of what you're hearing about some of those diverse ways of supporting BBNJ delivery, and what do you think some of either the criteria that are needed to be filled, or even the types of support that may be the most impactful and long-lasting?
Yeah, and within the framework of the Ocean Decade, I think our greatest contribution, it'd be something that we've been discussing a lot in the context of the Foundation's dialogue, is to support, is to finance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusive science and inclusive solutions as well. So philanthropic institutions, funders have this will and this power to influence the way things may be done by funding it. And we've been discussing a lot how to include all of these principles. So we have the opportunity to act as guardians of these principles. And then we can guarantee that not only that you can include Global South, small islands, development states, traditional knowledge in the table as well, and have more, not only access to some funding, but also a voice to be heard and including the decision making. And as we've seen during these 3 days, I think the most successful cases of implementation, for example, from MPAs, comes from process that used co-design process. Mm-hmm. So from day one, not only included afterwards and then inviting other stakeholders in traditional community and to inform, but from day one, bringing community, government, private sector, third sector, stakeholders, scientists to the decision make. So this is a process we talk a lot within the Ocean Decade framework, and it would be amazing to be included in BBNJ. And last, I think we should break the silos of philanthropy. BBNJ is not only about ocean issues, it's not an ocean niche, it's about climate, biodiversity, about food security. So invite, engage all of these different philanthropic institutions as well to work together and to work into your common goals and ground.
Wonderful. And I do want to pick up on that point about co-design, because I remember from some of the very earliest conversations in the Foundation's dialogue, you and Charlotte Hudson, who was at Pew at the time, and a couple of others really insisted that co-design only happens when there's time and there's resources and there's skills. And I think that group, with that core, but the broader Foundation's dialogue, has been really instrumental in helping the broader funding and resource provider world understand that if we want good co-designed science, somebody needs to pay for that. It costs money for people to come together. And so I think as we're thinking about BBNJ and the need for co-designed responses to optimize delivery, that is a message that we need to really keep pushing as well. Okay, Renato, last question from me, and then I'm going to stop talking so much and come to the questions from the audience in Slido, so keep putting them in. I've got 3, I've sort of merged some of them together around 3 big themes that we're going to put to the panel, but please do put in others if you're thinking of them. So Renato, I want to come to capacity development, because we've been hearing that in most of the panels I've heard, regardless of whether it's science, it's finance, it's traditional knowledge, this keeps coming up. And again, a very big question, but what do you really see as some of the key capacity development gaps, and thus the priorities for BBNJ delivery, that the Ocean Decade could really help to fill?
I think that the big gaps here is really to understand how takes this in practice. And I try to answer that in 3 dimensions. Is who, how, and when. Because we need to come back for the first answer. We need to map all those users or stakeholders engaged and involved in the BBNJ implementation. And we need to think in really capacity development for them. And there will be different strategies for workshops of science policy, for courses, for bringing people together, for sometimes only even the communication, but we will need to really identify then in the right strategies. But then is how we are doing that. We listen a lot about the co-design and bring that. And do we really know how to do co-design? Are we really being inclusive and bringing all the voices that are needed? So we still have a gap here, and we need to make sure we are fulfilling that gap and all the voices are properly being heard, and if you have in the workshops and so on. But so you know who and how and co-designing with all those stakeholders, but when we are doing that, and we need to recognize there are different timing here. Of course, we need to start to implement it, and there are some stakeholders that need to get this capacity development now. But how long are we going to do capacity development for the new persons that will be involved in the implementation? So in short term, we need some workshops, science policy, training that you make that happen. In medium and long term, we need to prepare the next ones that are coming. And there I go back for the blue curriculum, because the blue curriculum only links with schools and actually is all the groups. Are we already bringing for the oceanographic courses and all courses in the universities, actually, because not only from the oceanographic groups, about the BBNJ? Are we already teaching them when they are now getting read as ECOPs? And if you go in 20 years, because even Julian said when he starts, well, this discussion starts 20 years ago and is coming now. In more 20 years, who probably will be leading some of that discussion is now in the school. So are we just bringing a little bit of those visions straight away to make the difference later on? So we need to fulfill all those gaps for different groups with science policy, education, communication, and getting the ready strategy for this.
And again, over different timelines. So
over different timelines. And if you allow me, sorry, and one very important thing, this discussion needs to be from the ground. We are moving to COP1. Are ocean literacy and communication being considered as something for BBNJ implementation from now? Or are we going to move in how to implement and later on say, oh, we need to consider how we engage people in talk society? No, we learned that with the Ocean Decade. It must be in all workshops and COP from the ground. Their voices and their strategy. It's from the moment zero.
No, wonderful, inspiring words, and I think we'll be looking to you to make sure that in the workshops for the preparation of Rio, we are getting that approach and having those voices. So thank you very, very much. Okay, we have 7 minutes left, and I want to be very mindful of time. But as I said, there are lots of great questions coming through Slido. We're not going to get to them all, so I am going to try and group them around some big themes, and then I'll ask whoever of our panelists would like to jump in, and they're very much focused on BBNJ and how we can all get better organised, particularly in the lead up to the Rio conference, so that we're having that impact afterwards. The first one touches on something that many of you raised: diversity. So youth, and some of the examples that were given: youth diversity, early career diversity, obviously geographic diversity, and making sure that we're having voices from the global south as well as the global north, and even diversity in terms of, you said society is very heterogeneous. Civil society, for example, how can we get civil society engaged in some of these debates as well? So from our panelists, how, given what we've described as the preparation process for Rio, what we want to see coming out of the conference, the importance of co-design, how do you think we and the conference organising team can be thinking about diversity in the preparation and in the conference itself? Who would like to start? Please, Janani, go ahead.
to start with something that Ronald mentioned, first this mapping. We need to know what we are considering, which it's going to be a really diverse audience and involvement. So this mapping of what are the different people we are considering this diversity and monitoring. So we have to take a deep look into ourselves in every, not only event, in every panel, every movement and decision, if you are considering these principles in all the moments. So mapping, monitoring, and informing people when all people engaged all the time. I think that's a way.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody else want to come in on this question? Ronaldo.
No, very quick, but getting from what Jana is saying is considering that their voices need to be heard. So how can we have all map out that is diverse, and not only to be in the audience, but to be here and to be part. So we need, for example, when we think probably about Rio and all the workshops and conferences, to understand how many speakers are we having, how we will split in that categories, and making sure their voice will be there. I think that starts to make the change.
Make it a theme of the conference.
Yep.
And then drive that into the programs and the projects, and they'll come up with
ways of making that happen. Yep. No, I love that. That's great. Thank you. Okay, so the next one, and this is for all of you, although I do note we have a 50% Brazilian panel, and this is a particular question that has come up many, many times on Slido, somewhat related. How do we ensure strong national engagement, given, Julian mentioned, Leandro mentioned, the leadership of Brazil in ocean science? It was the first national decade committee created out of the 43 that exist. So many through INPO and others, so much happening in terms of leading ocean science, but also applications and services and so on. How do we make sure this conference, which is a global conference, 3,500 people, Barcelona, we had 120 countries represented. So how do we ensure that the Brazilian initiatives are showcased and really well represented at the conference? Or are there particular things that you would really like to see showcased at the conference?
I can start because I think I have a slightly different view for many people on that. I think that our problem hosting the next conference is not how we really have people engaged, is what we will be doing with the number of people that we want to be engaged, because we usually have national conferences in Brazil with 5,000 people. So our community used to be really engaged. I see Andre nodding there. So I think that our challenge as global conference will be for Brazilians understand that there will be a limited number of Brazilians that you need to be here, and then goes back for the diversity as well in all levels, how we guarantee that from the Brazilians that will be in the global conference, you represent that diversity, but the side events will be really important. And they will be really important for another point that we also is important, for us to really have then at national level engaged, we need to have also side events in Portuguese. Because when we think in having our national audience coming for a global conference in English is already limited, because it's not our main language. So we are not being inclusive from there. But that is the rule of a global conference. So how can we probably, as national committee, we will have this challenge to consider how we can have side events, mainly in Portuguese with some translations, but where people feel more comfortable to be part of it.
Super important, thank you. We did have a discussion with the national partners at the ministry yesterday, just thinking that issue through. What interpretation are we going to have? And this was mostly in the main conference, and I know you're talking about the side events, but it's certainly an issue that's at the forefront of our minds. So yeah, thank you for raising that. Janina.
Yeah, just a bit compliment. I would say something in the sense, the first step is quite simple, is the language. See, I forgot the name in English now. So that's an example. I thought about doing that. Just kidding, but I'm smart in Portuguese, and I think everybody here that speaks Portuguese or in your native in languages will be much more comfortable with that. And you have to take the opportunity of having such innovative technologies, AI, and so on. And I think until April, you have that much more consolidated, and then you can have not only Portuguese spoken events, but many languages spoken events, and you can use these technologies and bring different voices.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, look, we've pretty much come to the end, but I do want to give you each 3 more words or 5 more words to say one concrete action that you'd like to see happen between now and the end of the decade to accelerate BBNJ delivery. So please, in 5 to 7 words, let's say. Ronaldo, would you like to start? And we'll come back this way.
For sure, I would like to see a strategy for ocean interdevelopment and engage for BBNJ with the Ocean Decade.
Yeah, harping on the same point I've been making, I'd like to see OBIS working on the network criteria and how to support the network criteria under BBNJ and interoperation with BBNJ and ABMT proposals.
Great. The word that is floating in my mind all these days, the co-design, yeah. That be a prerequisite, that be included since the beginning as a framework for the big programs and BBNJ programs and decisions.
And Margaret, last word.
How are the programs going to ensure that at the end of the decade, there's still a resource for BBNJ? They need to think about that right now.
Yeah. And a perfect point to end us on, the legacy of the Ocean Decade and how through the Rio conference we can contribute to that for BBNJ, but also for the other issues. So thank you to all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. We need to build on the unique characteristics of the Ocean Decade. We need to use the decade to identify the gaps, the priorities, to have relevant and timely data information services, make sure we're mapping the targets so we know who we're talking to, we know who we're focusing on for diversity, for capacity development, for ocean literacy, have real voices at the table and real diversity of voices at the table, and then the legacy. Make sure that when we all walk away from Rio on the 10th of April next year, as we did in Barcelona, that there is a legacy left behind. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the audience. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.